Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of 30 Albums for 30 Years, 1964 through 1994, where we take a look and a listen to the most impactful albums between those years, and I do it chronologically by release date. So the plan is 30 albums per year for 30 years, 900 albums. Let's see if I can persevere. That's a lot of work. I am your host, Jay Sweet. Now, people keep asking me, when are you going to get to the Rolling Stones? When are you going to get to the Rolling Stones? I'm like, guys, relax, we'll get there. Well, today's the day. We are here. In today's episode, we are going to be listening and learning about the album The Rolling Stones, England's newest hit makers, on London Records, released in the US in May of 1964. Recorded between January 3rd through February 25th of that year. So let's get into it. Let's learn about the Stones. Let's learn about the album. So if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that when it comes to early rock and roll, I'm a Beatles guy, through and through. So there's always been this debate as to who do you like better? Who's the better band, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones? People who are Stones fans really love the band. I mean, they get tattoos of the band's Lips logo on their body, sometimes in pretty intimate places. I don't recall seeing too many Beatles tattoos. I have a weird relationship with the Rolling Stones. I go in and out with them. For a long time, I had this disdain for the Stones. There were tunes I liked, some I loved, but as a whole, I didn't quite get it. Now, I'm a product of the 1980s, and particularly like 80s metal and 80s pop, basically a child of MTV pop culture. So when it came to the Rolling Stones, I couldn't really see the appeal. For the most part, there were no screaming guitar solos, there were no showcases of extreme technicality, and to be honest, I kind of found Mick Jagger's dancing comical and not particularly cool, especially compared to Michael Jackson, who I was watching on TV. Even as a young music student, I could already play many of the Rolling Stones' guitar parts, their bass parts, and can probably tackle many of their drum grooves, and I'm not any type of a prodigy. And I would say to myself, as a 13, 14-year-old, if this is supposed to be the greatest rock and roll band as they bill themselves, how is it possible that I could play their music? Now, although I was maybe playing the music technically correct, it never really sounded right. So I eventually dug my heels in a little, and I realized that, the reason it doesn't sound right is because the Rolling Stones have a specific groove and a sound that's kind of pure and honest. And even though, I could copy the notes technically, I couldn't really land on that feel. Then eventually, I started to listen to more Stones music, and particularly dug into the period in which guitarist Mick Taylor was in the band, which was 1969 and 1974, 69 to 74, and the guitar work was more technically impressive. The songwriting was more specific, and yet it still had that same Rolling Stones purity and honesty. So my opinion began to slowly change regarding the Rolling Stones. Now, in doing this podcast, I have in fact developed a deeper appreciation for much of their earlier work and overall catalog. So this led me to think about why the band is so beloved and how have they lasted for 6 decades. And in many ways it makes sense. The Rolling Stones check all the boxes when it comes to a great rock and roll band. I mean, number one, they have a specific sound that's not reproducible. They also have a lead singer with a signature voice and sound, and a confidence that most average people wish they had, which makes for a great frontman. They also have an impactful secondary central figure in Keith Richards, who not only defies science by living a rock and roll lifestyle and surviving activities that would probably kill most of us 10 times over, but as a musician, he has an overall spirit and sound that is also characterized by a distinct purity and a connection to the past. as a student of the blues. Despite the fact that he's not really a wizard on the instrument technically, he does have a special sound and a specific way of playing. And then additionally, bassist Bill Wyman and drummer Charlie Watts had a unique rhythmic chemistry that provided a specific laid-back groove that adds to the overall characteristics of the overall sound of the Rolling Stones. So, do I believe the Rolling Stones are the greatest rock and roll band ever, which is how they have been marketed? Admittedly, the answer is no. But are they worthy of the career that they've had and the success that they have enjoyed? The answer is now a resounding yes. But still, I'm not going to go get a Rolling Stone lips tattoo on my body. Alright, cats, time to learn a little bit more about the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones began with a schoolhood friendship between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in 1950. Early on, Jagger and Richards grew inspired by American bluesmen like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Chuck Berry, and others. The two began playing local gigs with another friend, bassist Dick Taylor, as the Blues Boys. By 1962, Jagger and Richards had moved to London, where they met guitarist Brian Jones, drummer Charlie Watts, and keyboard player Ian Stewart. At the time, Jones served as the group's leader, and under his direction, they named the group the Rolling Stones after a Muddy Waters song. By the end of the year, bassist Bill Wyman had replaced Dick Taylor, who left to return to art school and later formed the band The Pretty Things, which had some success, but compared to the Stones, his group was more like a pebble. By 1963, Andrew Loog Oldham, an ex-publicist for the Beatles, began managing and marketing the Rolling Stones. He successfully publicized the Stones as a crude and more hardcore alternative to the Beatles, and he also encouraged the band to fire keyboardist Ian Stewart because he didn't fit into the group's image, and he felt that 6 members were just too many for people to remember. So Ian Stewart becomes the group's road manager, their driver, and sometimes the studio keyboard player. And somehow, he seemed fine with that role. Oldham then successfully began a media blitz introducing the Rolling Stones with extreme claims that the group was England's hottest band. So the Stones released their first US record, the record we're going to be listening to today, called England's Newest Hitmakers in 1964, and they briefly toured the US. At that time, they were not met with anywhere near the same fanfare as the Beatles in the States, and the tour was not an overwhelming success. The album, though, did reach number 11 on the US Billboard Charts, and their only US single to chart in the top 40s from the record was Tell Me, which reached number 24. So while the album England's Newest Hitmakers failed to make the Rolling Stones America's Newest Hitmakers, the Stones began to roll into America slowly, and the stone eventually grew into a boulder that continued to rock and roll for nearly 60 years. Alright, let's do it. Let's drop the needle on the record and get into it. Track number 1 of side 1 is Not Fade Away. Not Fade Away was written by the great early rocker Buddy Holly and recorded with his group The Crickets in 1957. The song is noted for a specific rhythmic pattern known as the Bo Diddley beat. Diddley was another impactful early figure who blended blues and rock and roll and inspired the Stones. The Stones' version of Not Fade Away became the group's first top 10 hit in the UK, charting at number 3, but it only reached number 48 on the US charts. Take notice of Mick Jagger's double-tracked vocals and Brian Jones's harmonica work. The group's version was considered hard-driving for its time, and is one of the best songs on the album. The Rolling Stones certainly did not fade away. Alright, so before we listen to the track, I wanted to display that Bo Diddley beat for you. So check it out. Here it is. So you will hear that groove in a lot of early rock and roll, including the song Not Fade Away. Alright, let's get out our maps because it's time to travel Route 66. That's track number 2 on the record. Route 66 is an R&B classic written in 1946 by Bobby Troup. He wrote it after a long 10-day drive from Pennsylvania to California, where Troup and his wife traveled Route 66. It's a tune that mentions a lot of American towns and cities and is basically about the thrills of hitting the open road. Nat King Cole, who is amazing, first recorded the song the same year in which it was written and made Route 66 a big hit. The Rolling Stones version is a little more rocking than Cole's, and it is one of the album's bright spots. Keith Richards' signature rhythmic guitar playing is showcased on this track. Enjoy Route 66. This track is I Just Want to Make Love to You, which plays into the Rolling Stones' raunchy, hard-driving image. It's fast, it's noisy, and it's bluesy. The song was written by upright bassist and blues songwriter extraordinaire Willie Dixon. I'm a big fan. And in 1954, Muddy Waters, also a fan, had a hit with the tune. And the Stones loved Muddy Waters, so it all makes sense. The lyrics are easy to figure out. The narrator is saying, I don't care what you do, or if you're lazy as hell, I just want to make love to you. Brian Jones plays some pretty killer harmonica on the song. It's an album highlight. Check it out. I Just Want to Make Love to You, track number 3. The fourth track on the original LP is Honest I Do, which was written by American bluesman Jimmy Reed. The Stones have often cited Reed as a major influence, and the guitars are so out of tune on this track that it kind of makes me hate that it exists on the album. Honest, I do. But it does exist, it is part of the album, so you check it out, you decide. Honest, I Do, track number 4. Alright, this next track is Now I've Got a Witness, which is a simplistic instrumental credited to the songwriting team of Nanker and Phelge. Nanker, Nanker, Phelge, Phelge. Now try to find a picture of these guys because it doesn't exist. Nanker and Phelge is a pseudonym used by the Rolling Stones. It's as if they didn't even want credit for their own music. The only genuine interest comes from Brian Jones's harmonica playing and the fact that they let Ian Stewart play some keys on the track. Keith Richards' lead guitar work could honestly be a little bit more impressive, but you listen, you be the witness. Now I've Got a Witness, track number 5. The final track of side 1 is Little by Little, which was written by the Stones and producer Phil Spector, who plays maracas on the track. Phil Spector was one of the premier producers and writers of early rock and roll music. Unfortunately, he was also a nut who was convicted of murder in 2007. This song is one of the group's best early recordings. It's bluesy and it's raw. And Spector and the band seem to pay slightly more attention to the recording process for this track. They brought in pianist Gene Pitney to play keys, again a diss to Ian Stewart, who really endured a lot. And singing backup on the track are Graham Nash, who later found success with Crosby, Stills and Nash, and Alan Clark from the band The Hollies. Little by little. Alright, time to flip the album, flip the record, and drop the needle on side number 2. And track number 1 is I'm a King Bee, which was released in 1957 by bluesman Slim Harpo. The tune is an overly sexualized, syrupy blues, and maybe the best track on the album. I would still rather hear the original artist's versions, to be quite honest, but this is pretty authentic blues, and it showcases Brian Jones on the slide guitar and Mick Jagger on the harmonica. Sting it. I'm a King Bee. This next track is a high flyer written by Chuck Berry from 1958 called Carol. Now, Berry tended to rewrite new lyrics to the same songs repeatedly, and Carol is basically Johnny B. Good. The Stones do a pretty solid job on this one. Check it out. Carol. Track number 3 of side 2 is Tell Me, which is the first A-side single written by Jagger and Richards. Interestingly, it's not a blues. For me, the tune gets pretty annoying at times, and the lyrics sound desperate, especially after the bravado of songs like I Just Want to Make Love to You and Bumblebee. So Tell Me is basically about a guy begging for his lover to return. And again, the chorus is whiny and annoying. Honestly, I'm glad that she left. I would have. But the song hit number 27 on the US Billboard Charts, so people liked it. The Belgians and the Swedes loved it. They made it a number 1 hit in their markets. So you check it out and you tell me. This next cut is Can I Get a Witness, which was written by the all-star writing team of Holland, Dozier, and Holland in 1963 and recorded initially by the great Marvin Gaye. Now, his version is much better, but the Stones do make a reasonable effort and welcome back Ian Stewart. On this track, they allowed him to play and not just witness. Next up is You Can Make It If You Try, which was a lesser-known hit in 1957 for R&B vocalist Gene Allison. With You Can Make It If You Try, the Stones missed the mark with this one. They didn't quite make it, and I'm not even really sure that they did try. Track number 6, the final track on the original LP, is Walking the Dog. The song was written and recorded in 1963 by Rufus Thomas, and it became a novelty dance hit. You'll notice that the Rolling Stones sure do like to add hand clapping in their earlier music. You can hear that here. Walking the Dog. All right, my friends, we did it. We made it to the end of the record, and of course, we are better for it. So lift the needle, take the record off of the player, slide it back into the jacket, and put it back on the shelf. Do it gently. All right, so in conclusion, England's newest Hitmakers is an impactful album, not because it's perfect, it's actually quite rough in some areas, but because it is the first US release by a rock band with incredible longevity and success. The album showcases a division between the early output quality of the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and of course the other bands associated with the British invasion. Now, while the Stones are pretty raw early on, there is a certain charm in hearing them work it all out on this and on other early releases. Now again, the album reached number 11 on the US Billboard Charts and received gold record status. Alright guys, thanks for listening to the podcast. Really enjoyed doing it. If you like what you've heard and want to learn more about this album or other albums, please go to the website 30albums for30years.com. Also check out my book, The History of American Music 1750 through 1950, an origin story from Kendall Hunt Publishers. Stick around, we got some bonus material on this next one, and together let's keep the music alive. Have a great day.